And I want to thank everyone who had me join this panel, because it's been very educational, and so little is known about the war in Yemen in the United States. There is just so little known about it. And I'm going to frame my brief remarks in talking about how we can go about taking on the responsibility of explaining this war to our friends, to our neighbors, to our coworkers, because there is so much misinformation and confusion about it in the country. I mean, in the United States, I'm sure in the UK as well, average people on the street just have no idea what is going on in Yemen. And when they think they know what's going on in Yemen, they're even more misinformed than if they didn't know. And in the United States right now, there are big political divisions. Folks saw what happened on January 6th and the attack on the US Capitol. Because of that, there are big divisions. And we really have overall roughly two narratives going out about the war in Yemen. And both of these narratives, one from the more liberal wing of the American ruling class, one from the more conservative, or I guess I should say neoconservative wing of the American ruling class. And both of these narratives are completely and utterly false. The first narrative that we hear from American mainstream media, from outlets like MSNBC and CNN that lean closer to the Democratic Party, the narrative that we hear is that this war in Yemen is just complicated. It is an ethnic and tribal conflict. These are groups of people that have been fighting with each other for thousands of years. It's something we in the West just can't possibly understand. So you should change the channel and look the other way and just assume that this is something that only people with PhDs in Middle Eastern history and such can actually understand. That's the way liberals would like us to understand it. Well, that narrative is completely and utterly false. If people in the United States can understand an event called the American Revolution, then they can understand what is happening in Yemen. The people of Yemen, a country that is very poor, is fighting for its national liberation. It doesn't want a foreign king and a foreign regime to dominate their country and keep it economically destitute. They are fighting for their national liberation. It's quite interesting that often one fact that is obscured by American media, when they'll talk about the Houthis and Ansar Allah, one thing that they won't talk about is their logo. You very rarely will see the logo of the Ansar Allah movement. And if you look at the logo of the Ansar Allah movement, it has a hand representing the hand of God. It has a gun representing the right to armed self-defense, something that many Americans very strongly feel is important. But there's also one item on the logo that is very important in understanding this war, and that is a shaft of wheat. If you look at the logo of Ansar Allah, it has a shaft of wheat. And the reason that their logo has a shaft of wheat on it is because that shaft of wheat represents economic development. Saudi domination of Yemen is about keeping Yemen an underdeveloped country. It is about keeping Yemen in an economic state of poverty as simply a client state of the Saudis. And what the revolutionary movement in Yemen is fighting for is breaking those chains and allowing Yemen to build up its own economy and develop. There was a BBC interview where they interviewed a leader of the Ansar Allah movement, and he said that not only do they study the Islamic Revolution of Iran, that they also study what is happening in Venezuela with Bolivarian socialism, and that they are inspired by many different revolutionary movements around the world, because ultimately what this war is about Yemeni people and the Yemeni nation struggling to rise out of poverty and to develop its own economy. And that's the basis of this. So that liberal narrative that it's too complicated to understand is completely and utterly wrong. It is a nation fighting for its independence. You could say that Yemen is almost the Vietnam of our time. Now, the second narrative that we get, and this is from more neoconservative leaning outlets. You get this from Fox News in particular. You get this from the Wall Street Journal and outlets associated with Rupert Murdoch and more explicitly neoconservative elements, is they don't say it's too complicated to understand. They say that this is a proxy war with Iran. That is their narrative. They say, well, this isn't really about Yemen. This is Iran trying to take over Yemen. This is an Iranian conspiracy to start a war. So we have to fight Iran in Yemen. And that narrative is also completely and utterly false. But it's quite interesting if you draw a historical parallel, because it forces me to think about a time in US history. You know, you go back to the 1950s, 1954, you had an event called the Montgomery bus boycott, where the African-American community was mobilizing in the thousands against Jim Crow segregation and protesting. And what did American media say about the massive protests that were happening in the US South? They said that this was a conspiracy from the Soviet Union. It was a communist plot. The civil rights movement was a communist conspiracy. It's not that the Black people of the United States want freedom and the right to, you know, eat in whatever restaurant they want and be able to vote and drink out of the same drinking fountains as white people. Oh no, this is all a conspiracy from Moscow. Now, there was a grain of truth, right? Let's not forget that the Communist Party had organized for civil rights long before any other progressive forces in the United States had. Let's not forget that at the UN, the Soviet Union brought the petition called We Charge Genocide and called out the racism of the United States at the United Nations and gave a platform to people like William L. Patterson and Henry Winston and Paul Robeson and many great African-American activists to expose racism. So there was a grain of truth in that narrative. But overall, the reason that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and millions of people in the United States were protesting for civil rights was not because of the Soviet Union. It was because of their real conditions becoming intolerable and the demand for justice being widespread. And if this war in Yemen were simply an Iranian conspiracy, it would have been over in a week, right? The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has the fourth largest military budget of any country in the world. Meanwhile, Yemen is one of the deeply poorest countries on the planet. It's really a country where people are facing just impoverished conditions. And the fact that the people of Yemen have continued to fight against the largest military budget, the fourth largest military budget in the world, and completely continued to withstand this criminal blockade that has prevented them from getting medicine and supplies. The fact that they have held out so long and continued to resist as just, you know, mass deaths of malnutrition, bombing of civilian infrastructure. The fact that in face of all of this, they have continued to resist is about as much of a solid proof that this is not a conspiracy from Iran that could ever be. If there was not widespread support for the national liberation movement of the people of Yemen, then this war would certainly not have continued so long. I'm forced to think of a very important quotation from Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution. In one of his last statements that was delivered, he said that the people of a small country can surely defeat aggression by a big country. This is a law of history, but only if they dare to rise in struggle. And those words just ring in my ears every time I think about the conflict in Yemen, because this is the people of a small country facing aggression by a big country, but rising in struggle and resisting. And this law of history that Mao Zedong talked about seems to be very well alive. I will just conclude by saying that in 2015, after this war had just started, I had the honor and the privilege of accompanying the Red Crescent Society of the Islamic Republic of Iran on a ship to try and deliver humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen. And for me, as someone from the United States, this was a life-changing experience. I spent 13 days on that ship. We had all kinds of wheat and all kinds of medical supplies. We had surgeons on board. We had technicians of an operating theater. And it was a purely humanitarian mission by the Red Crescent Society. And we were unable to reach the port of Hodeidah in 2015 because the port of Hodeidah was bombed 8 times on the day we were chartered to arrive. I was bombed 8 times, and to prevent this humanitarian mission from arriving, they murdered basically a number of dock workers, a number of medical students. They bombed the medical university in Hodeidah, and we were forced to turn our ship around And we had to go then to Djibouti, and we handed over our medical supplies and our food relief to the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And we assume that aid was delivered, but we really don't know. There's a lot of distrust for the United Nations Relief Works Agency and such. But it was a crime against humanity. You cannot block humanitarian aid from being delivered. And they tried to spread lies. In the media, they claimed that there were weapons on board our ship, and this was somehow an effort to deliver weapons. Well, when the United Nations Relief Works Agency inspected our ship, they saw that there were no weapons on the ship. We were not engaging in any kind of military operation. We were simply trying to deliver humanitarian aid, but the Saudis prevented it and murdered people to prevent that aid from being delivered. And what happened, while it was certainly well known throughout the Middle East, it was not widely known. It was reported on a little bit in American media, but it got very little coverage. The fact that a humanitarian mission with citizens, not just me from the United States, there was a German citizen on board, there was a French citizen on board, there were a number of Iranians on board, that we were prevented from delivering humanitarian aid. And that shows how ruthless the Saudis really are, that they have been given a free pass when it comes to violating international law, committing war crimes, committing atrocities, not just internationally, but against their own people as well. Let's not forget the horrendous way that the Shia oil workers of Saudi Arabia are treated, the way they are viciously exploited, the way Sheikh Namir al-Namir, a leader who had fought for the civil rights of the Shia oil workers of Saudi Arabia, was brutally executed. So we need to continue to raise awareness about what's going on. We need to continue to talk to our friends, to our co-workers, to our classmates if we're students at universities, and get the truth out there about what is taking place in Yemen. I think that the last minute move by the Trump administration to label the Ansar Allah group as terrorists was strategically done. It follows the vein of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, of the ripping up of the Iran nuclear deal, that there are different factions within our ruling class in the United States that have differences about how to handle the conflict in the Middle East, and that Trump aligned himself with Netanyahu and the Likud party in Israel, and that they had a particular interest in preventing any negotiations. The aim was to make it more difficult for Biden to negotiate both with the Islamic Republic of Iran and now with the revolutionary forces in Yemen, by labeling them as terrorists, by murdering the top Iranian general. The effort is to try and prevent negotiations so the money for weapons manufacturers such as Betsy DeVos, right? Betsy DeVos, Trump's Secretary of Education, is the brother of Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, the huge military contracting corporation. And, to keep the weapons flowing in, to keep building the Arab NATO the Trump administration wants to build, to keep selling all kinds of armaments to US-aligned despotic regimes throughout the Middle East. There's a desire to prevent any negotiation or softening of relations. But we can hope that perhaps one positive that can come out of the new administration is perhaps they will have a different approach. Perhaps some kind of negotiation can take place. And perhaps the United States will recognize that the people of Yemen are not going to surrender. They are going to keep fighting for their national liberation. So it would be better to negotiate with them. It would be better to call off their Saudi attack dogs. And it would be better to somehow recognize the Yemeni people and their right to have their own government and their own national sovereignty. So I think there is hope that perhaps some negotiation can take place. There are differences among our ruling classes, both in the United States and in Britain. But we should all be doing all we can to raise awareness about the real crimes against humanity that are happening in Yemen, but also to raise awareness about the relentless spirit of the Yemeni people and their fight for national liberation. Thank you.